Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. It began with a signal, clean, unambiguous, and wrong. From an observatory fixed at the edge of the heliopause, Lyra 5 registered a burst of radiation with the unmistakable signature of Hawking decay. That, in itself, would have been a marvel, except the source had been cold for centuries. HRX 887, a relic in the Perseus cluster, was catalogued as inert. No accretion disk, no activity, dead. But the emission profile told a different story. The system flagged it as an anomaly and sent it through the filters. Calibration checks returned nominal. Instrument drift? None. Cosmic interference? Not a chance. The spectrum was too precise. But something else was embedded in the data. Subtle, near the noise floor, almost like the decay curve had been traced in reverse. Not just unusual. Inverted. Specialists reviewed the thermal map. The area surrounding HRX 887 wasn't heating up as expected from outgoing radiation. Instead, it was losing thermal energy. Infrared telescopes confirmed a region growing colder, uniformly, steadily, impossibly. The entropy profile wasn't rising. It was falling. Irreversible processes reversing. No physical model could support it. The telemetry log began to accumulate edge case variables. Spin vectors showed mild shifts, not from external torque, but as if the black hole's own momentum was being drawn inward. Gravitational readings were consistent, but subtle time discrepancies began to appear in the quantum clock arrays. Non-random, non-noise. There was coherence where there should be chaos. A pattern in decay. That was the moment when something cracked in the assumptions. No explanation held. Not a misreading. Not equipment error. No simulation reproduced it. One by one, theoretical frameworks fell apart. The event horizon, long assumed a point of no return, appeared to act like a one-way membrane, only in reverse. What should have been loss was becoming gain. Energy was flowing into the singularity with measurable intent. Mass accumulation without accretion. Matterless weight. The implications settled in like frostbite. If Hawking radiation could be reversed, then thermodynamics wasn't absolute. If entropy could decline, time's arrow could bend. If the laws of physics were fracturing out there, what would stop the break from reaching here? The team didn't speak of it at first. The silence wasn't fear. It was the slow realization that they were staring at something outside the lexicon of science. Not a glitch. Not a mystery. A violation. They archived the data. Marked it. HRX 887. An object that didn't emit heat. A singularity that didn't decay. A field of space where disorder did not grow but contracted. For the first time in generations, the void pushed inward, not with violence but precision. And across every monitoring station, every instrument tuned to the coordinates, the numbers pulsed with that cold, impossible rhythm. Unyielding. Measured. As though something had begun to awaken from its own gravitational tomb, not to speak, not to reach, but to correct. The meeting wasn't scheduled. It was summoned. A coded transmission reached Orbital Research Command less than 7 hours after the anomaly confirmed. No directive, no conference tree. Just coordinates, clearance, and silence. Those who received it understood something had shifted, not politically, not diplomatically, but deeper. Something at the structural level of reality had given way, and whatever lived in the breach had already taken its first breath. 5 were chosen. Not through politics. Not through favor. Chosen because they understood one thing above all else. When the rules of the universe begin to erode, there's no protocol, only witness. They arrived without ceremony. There were no farewells, no press briefings, no images sent home. Each carried knowledge shaped by decades, and each had the same unease, though none would name it. They were not being sent to discover, but to confront. The Mercator waited in dry orbit, humming with stored power, inertial stabilizers coiled for deep time. A vessel designed not for comfort, not for speed, but for survival at relativistic edge. Every panel inside the hull had been stripped of aesthetic. No colors, no curves, only function, walls embedded with radiation buffers, compartments that could seal airtight in milliseconds, data cores wrapped in cold-forged tungsten shells. Before launch, they were given the transmission. No introduction, no framing. A probe's final telemetry. Timestamps misaligned, radiation profiles inverted, decay curves converging backward, entropy graphs collapsing as if time itself had knelt. The words of the mission lead barely broke above a whisper. This is either the beginning of a new model or the end of all models. Their mandate was surgical. Record gravitational variance across event horizon strata. Monitor subatomic asymmetries. Confirm directionality of radiation vectors. Measure entropy flows. But the purpose none of them spoke aloud: to witness whether the universe had begun to write itself backwards. Final system checks blinked green. The engine core powered to full field. No one spoke as the Mercator detached. No final looks toward Earth. No recording of departure. Only acceleration into the dark between clusters, toward a point that had once been declared unremarkable, until it refused to stay quiet. Silence accompanied them. Not from restraint, but necessity. The quiet was not the absence of conversation, it was a shield. Against thought. Against meaning. Against the slow understanding that what they were approaching had not broken the laws of physics. It had simply stopped obeying them. HRX 887 did not resemble anything the charts had predicted. It didn't bend light in smooth arcs or flare with gravitational lensing. Its silhouette resisted curvature. Shapes near it didn't stretch, they broke. Angles misaligned by fractions of a second. Frames from the observation deck showed an object in motion, but side by side, the same object existed twice in different positions in the same frame. Not motion blur. Not interference. Multiplicity without duplication. An asteroid drifted into range, its trajectory calm, predictable. It passed the event horizon. 0.2 of a second later, it emerged. Not in full. Not undamaged. But intact enough to recognize. Its surface was sheared as if peeled backward through time. Scorch marks faced inward. The impact fractures radiated opposite their origin. The telemetry readouts processed the reappearance before it had finalized the disappearance. What was supposed to fall beyond recovery had not only returned, but returned wrong. They launched a probe. Standard diagnostic. Black body sensors, gravimetric pulse relay, an onboard quantum clock tied to Mercator's mainframe. The probe entered clean. For 12 minutes, it transmitted baseline data. At minute 13, silence. At minute 14, a new packet arrived. It bore the correct frequency, the same time signature, but it originated beyond the final recorded signal. The last log ended cleanly. No anomaly. No noise. Just closure. The new packet should not have existed, but it did. Contained within was identical memory, but reversed. The sequence of logged data ran backward, from completion to initiation. The radiation measurements dropped instead of climbed. Thermal variance regressed. Sensor outputs displayed reversed thermodynamic flow. Entropy inverted. They reviewed the packet again. The clock embedded in the probe's transmission counted downward. Every law of information decay broken. It had recorded events that hadn't happened yet, and delivered them in reverse. Sensors recalibrated. Field readings triangulated. Still, no source of external mass. No infall. No stellar wind. No dust stream. Nothing feeding the black hole. Yet the gravitational profile showed clear gain. Minute by minute, HRX 887 was growing. Not from matter. Not from energy. From what? Emma stepped away from her station. Her voice was low. It's gaining weight from nothing. Every display now showed a rise in singularity mass, clean, measurable, and cold. No disk. No jet. No corona. Only expansion. Quiet. Relentless. They stared through the observation lens. There was no chaos out there. No violence. Only order. That was the part no one could make sense of. Black holes were engines of disorder, of dissolution. They did not organize. They did not preserve. Yet here it was. A black hole consuming nothing and producing increase. Absorbing vacuum. Feeding on symmetry. Quietly revising everything. They were not witnessing collapse. They were witnessing structure. In a place where structure should not exist. The descent began at 1/3 thrust, stabilizers engaged, every panel dimmed to reduce cognitive interference. No conversation passed between them. The approach required no words. Each of them understood what the ergosphere meant, the outer shell where spacetime starts to tear sideways, not downward. Where motion isn't a choice, but a requirement. You don't pause in that orbit. You are dragged, like it or not. Initial telemetry read consistent. Rotation velocity aligned with Kerr metric. Polar deflection within model. But the ship's time sync pulse returned odd. The signal wasn't late. It was early. Not ahead by much, but enough to violate causality. A wave sent from the bow reached the stern before it left. Internal systems cross-checked, confirmed, repeated. The results held. Time inside the hull had fallen out of agreement with the time outside it. They had expected dilation. Predictable. Boring, even. Instead, they encountered distortion without gradient. Moments didn't stretch. They rearranged. The mainframe logged a 23-second gap where no systems registered anything. No power loss. No thermal drop. But a complete absence of recorded state. As if that slice of reality had been skipped. A maintenance drone docked to the outer hull began transmitting logs the crew hadn't requested. The reports included sensor fluctuations and pressure differentials scheduled for next week's inspection. Except none of that work had occurred. The logs were signed with dates yet to come, equipment movements not yet authorized. The drone hadn't moved, yet it had already completed repairs it had never started. They pulled the records. Inside the diagnostics was a secondary log, voice-tagged, clear, emotionless. A single line. Integrity breach portside midsection, sealed externally, 12 minutes into ergosphere descent. The timestamp matched the current mission time. 12 minutes hadn't passed. They rushed to portside. No breach. Seals intact. Structure uncompromised. They waited. Watched. Nothing changed. 12 minutes later, an impact shook the hull. Alarms low. No decompression. External plating had sheared, precisely as the log described. But it hadn't been a prediction. It had been a memory. One of them stood nearest the blast. He stepped back, staring through the viewport. His hand trembled, not from fear, but recognition. His suit had a tear on the left sleeve. He hadn't noticed. It was sealed now, but the burn mark was there. No one had spoken of fire. They reviewed internal surveillance. There he was, on his knees beneath the access panel. Sparks erupting. Pressure flaring from a misaligned valve. He repaired it quickly, with a calm that felt rehearsed. The others didn't remember seeing it happen. Because it hadn't. But the recording existed. It showed an event no one had witnessed, completed by someone who remembered nothing of it. The ship's own memory had outrun them. Reality wasn't folding or collapsing. It was replaying itself out of sequence. Every meter deeper into the ergosphere revealed less of space and more of time, twisted not by gravity, but by error. An error that didn't propagate but nested. Each observation overwrote the one before. Each certainty dissolved the moment it was accepted. The universe, it seemed, was misremembering itself. At 26 minutes past the threshold crossing, a plant in the hydroponic unit began to unshed. No one touched it. No environmental changes were recorded. Yet over the course of 90 seconds, 3 brown leaves lost their curl, dark edges retreating toward center veins, discoloration fading into chlorophyll. Stem tissue rehydrated. Cellular decay reversed. Moisture that had evaporated days ago reappeared in capillaries that had long since dried. Not a resurrection. A reversion. They documented it in silence. Nothing else moved. No airflow. No mechanical failure. Just growth backward. The sealed containment unit was next. A rat, dead 12 days, sealed under nitrogen and logged with a verified chain of custody, began to change. Time-lapse footage later confirmed it. The skin, once sunken, pulled taut. Bones reassembled. Fragments of spine rotated and aligned. Organs that had liquefied reformed without visible trigger. The decomposition gases dissipated into tissues that should no longer have accepted them. Muscles twitched. No breath returned. But neither had breath ever left. The timestamp showed no death recorded. None of them approached the glass. They ran system diagnostic. Power stable. Radiation levels unchanged. Atmospheric controls optimal. Every explanation collapsed under its own assumptions. They turned to audio logs, hoping for patterns in the event sequence. The last batch of voice entries loaded without error, but playback did not begin from the beginning. Each recording began with a pause, followed by syllables in reverse phoneme structure. Not electronically flip. Not digitally reversed. The waveform was symmetrical. There had been no tampering. The words were being logged backward as they were spoken. Thought itself recorded in regression. No one had noticed the speech reversal in real time. The logs did not sound wrong. They sounded unspoken. Someone suggested memory corruption. Another argued for a software exploit. The silence that followed wasn't agreement, it was the absence of better guesses. The mission parameters were reviewed. The margin for withdrawal was still open. But only briefly. The argument began without volume. Not a shouting match, but a slow erosion of unity. The navigator warned of timeline distortion. The biologist demanded further observation. One pointed to evidence, another to protocol. The commander listened, then raised a single hand. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The objective was verification. Not interpretation. Not immersion. Retreat. He issued it as a directive, not a suggestion. No one moved. Outside the observation deck, the anomaly remained silent. No ejections. No jet. No optical distortion. Just a zone of space where everything decayed in reverse, where entropy collapsed in on itself, where information lost its arrow. They were surrounded by order. Not imposed. Not natural. Simply present. The ship felt colder, though no temperature drop registered. Not physical. Not chemical. Something deeper. A quiet compression. They had passed into a place where time lost memory. And whatever governed motion here no longer obeyed the sequence they had been born into. The signal arrived without transmission protocols. It bypassed encryption. No call sign. No origin tag. It opened on its own. The timestamp was from 6 hours ahead. The source ID matched the Mercator's communications array. Not similar. Identical. Waveform fidelity to the microhertz. It came from the ship. It had not been sent. It had not yet been composed. They stared at it. First came static. Ordinary rhythmic. Then pressure. Acoustic data spiking above human thresholds before normalizing. A voice broke through, strained, words compressed as if time itself had pulled them too tight. Don't observe it. A pause. The voice again, sharper, rawer, closer to collapse. Every observation fixes the wrong version. Silence followed. No explanation. No context. They replayed it. No change. No signature mismatch. The frequency belonged to the forward antenna. The energy signature matched current reactor output. The audio bore the exact modulation of shipboard vocal encoding. The voice was hers. She hadn't recorded it. They ran the logs. No file. No record of creation. No entry point. It had arrived complete, without a beginning. The message had not traveled through time. It had arrived from a time that hadn't happened yet. One of them stood to speak and stopped. Eyes focused on nothing. Jaw set. No one wanted to say the word. Look. Too many models. Too many thought experiments. Closed curves in spacetime, trapped light paths, temporal echoes. All theoretical. All unproven. All impossible under standard conditions. They weren't under standard conditions. If the message had originated in the future and been received in the present without traversing the interval between, then the interval no longer existed. Not fully. Not linearly. The ship's chronometer remained in sync. But a subtle drift began to show in sensor delay. Processes finished before they started. Commands confirmed before they were sent. She sat down. Quiet. Focused. Not afraid. They watched her. The voice in the message was hers. But it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a memory. They played it again. Don't observe it. Again. Every observation fixes the wrong version. Each time it played, the intonation shifted slightly. Not by much, but enough. Emphasis leaned in new directions. Cadence altered. As if the recording were being rewritten by the act of listening. The room tightened. They understood. Measurement was no longer passive. It was creation. To observe was to determine. To determine was to choose. And they had no idea how many versions had already been chosen. Crossing the event horizon was never the plan. Not officially. Not in the protocols. Not in the contingency layers buried beneath the mission charter. There was no scenario that justified breaching the point of no return. But nothing they were seeing belonged to the world those protocols had been written in, and the boundary they approached was not behaving like an event horizon. Instead of infinite redshift and terminal collapse, they encountered something else. The gravitational field didn't steepen. It folded. Light from the hull bounced inward and returned from angles that defied geometry. Instrument delay vanished. Sensor lag inverted. Time inside the core became more responsive than outside. They passed through it. There was no impact. No warping. No rupture. Just silence stretched thin. On the other side there was no singularity. What they found could not be described by any spacetime metric known to general relativity. It was not a point. It was not even a region. It was a condition. Each of them saw something different. One stood at the viewport and whispered the word lattice. He described columns of illumination, aligned without direction, pulsing without rhythm. No source. No destination. Just intersections. Photons obeying laws rewritten for smaller spaces. Places too fine-grained for human thought. Atoms breathe. Empty vacuum-shaped behavior. Another stood frozen near the navigation terminal, eyes wide, arms slack. She was watching herself. Not one version. Hundreds. Each locked in observation. Each looped in recursive stare. A hall of recognition with no mirrors. Each version recording the others. Each iteration waiting to become the next. Memory without anchor. Identity distributed across coordinates that changed with every blink. The last walked slowly through the main corridor and did not speak. She reached out, touched the wall, and saw her hand vanish into a distance that did not end. The ship was still intact, but it had lost its boundary. Bulkheads stretched across non-integer dimensions. A hallway became a continuum. Every step she took landed somewhere else. She turned to return and saw herself leaving. The instruments attempted to log measurement. They failed. Not from malfunction, but because the systems no longer agreed on what constituted length, or time, or separation. Planck scale topology emerged from the readings. Structures too small to exist, yet persistent in output. Not random. Not chaotic. Specific. Evolving in response to attention. The more they observed, the more the form changed. Matter was no longer passive. Space no longer inert. Gravity no longer external. Every aspect of the singularity reflected a preference. Not a fixed law, but an interpretation. The physics itself adjusted based on the presence of consciousness. Measurement didn't collapse possibility. It rendered the preferred version into being. One of them spoke. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just enough for the others to hear. It's not breaking physics. It's personalizing it. The ship was intact, but its shape no longer obeyed memory. What was once a corridor now moved. Not with motion, but intention. The layout had been mapped twice. Yet standing at the entrance of engineering led to medical. Walking forward returned to where they started. Not a circle. Not misnavigation. A closed path with no arc. The angles added up. The geometry did not. Doors opened into rooms they had already left. Equipment was found where it hadn't been stored. Labeled containers marked with dates that had not yet passed. The deck panels recorded pressure from footsteps never taken. Objects changed positions between glances. An access terminal displayed logs from systems that had never been online. Readings from the coolant reserve logged a maintenance cycle scheduled for next week. The file was signed. The signature matched. The action had not been performed. Distance no longer measured extension. It measured change. The farther they walked, the more the ship itself altered. Not externally. Internally. Space folded without movement. A wall 5 meters apart was reached in 3 steps, but the last step took longer than the first 2 combined. The deck underfoot began to measure time instead of length. Pressure sensors reported duration instead of weight. A closed hatch remained closed until someone looked away. When sight returned, it was open. Not unlocked. Not ajar. Open as if it had never been sealed. One of them tested the corridor. He marked the entry point, placed his palm on the hull, and walked forward. 12 paces. A turn. Another 12. He came to a room he recognized. Same dimensions, same lights, same console. But no one was there. Not just absent. Never there. Equipment untouched. Air still. Systems cold. He called back. No response. He waited. Repeated the path. It led back to the same room. Still empty. He walked a third time. He did not return. They searched for him. Same path. Same room. Empty. The logs confirmed his biosignature had passed through. It had not exited. But his shadow remained. It moved. It did not follow light. It did not mimic posture. It moved as if responding to a world just out of sync. A step early. A gesture delayed. A rhythm that did not belong to the body that once cast it. The temperature readings shifted. Not in magnitude, but in location. Heat moved faster than mass. Cold followed pressure. Environmental control systems reported inverted flow. Ventilation systems moved air backward through sealed duct. One corridor bent into itself. They watched as a straight hallway developed curvature. Not visually. Mathematically. A straight path with no corners returned to origin. Time indicators on wrist modules began to fragment. Hours repeated. Minutes skipped. A second lasted longer when watched. Clocks refused synchronization. Pulse rates diverged without physiological cause. Communication across decks began to fail, not from interference but disagreement. 2 voices transmitted simultaneously, yet received in reverse order. Instructions lost meaning. Syntax dissolved under conflict. Each phrase translated differently by each listener. The ship was not decaying. It was converting. Inside the zone, the laws that once linked space to motion, time to sequence, no longer held priority. Direction became perspective. Form became suggestion. And the anomaly did not force it. It allowed it. Each rule that failed revealed no chaos. Only permission. She reached for the terminal to input a diagnostic query, but the screen responded before her fingers made contact. The interface blinked once, responded with a summary of events that hadn't occurred, and offered options for outcomes she had not yet considered. She froze. The room hadn't changed, but her memory had. She recalled saying something to the others, clearly, urgently, in response to a hull breach that never took place. The memory was detailed. Exact phrasing, sequence of reaction, breath count between sentences. The problem was the hull was sealed, untouched. The others had no recollection of anything she described. When she repeated her version, it wasn't dismissed. It was documented. Because she wasn't alone in it. He remembered a failure in the coolant system that no sensor confirmed. She described a power fluctuation that had never been logged. Their memories aligned with events that had never been witnessed. No overlap, no shared hallucination. Just fully formed, conflicting pasts. One began running calculations against their environmental data. His results were unstable, shifting with each iteration. Same equation, same parameters, different result. The more he refined the dataset, the less agreement he found with previous output. Observation was not reducing uncertainty, it was creating new configurations. No variance, no randomness, just pure divergence. He stepped back from the console and said the sentence without hesitation. We are not observing the system. We are writing it. It wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't metaphor. The field they had entered responded to attention. Not subtly. Not in the way particles spin when measured. This was macroscopic. Structural. The position of objects, the configuration of space, the course of time, none of it persisted without interaction. The moment they stopped looking, the arrangement reverted. The moment they engaged, it reformed. Not simulation. Not illusion. Actual geometry shifted in response to conscious inference. One returned to the archival bay. She accessed the mission log. It should have been a blank shell, an administrative template waiting for completion. Instead, it was populated. Dated 6 years prior to launch. Pages of entries. Crew analysis. Flight anomalies. Field data from regions they had not yet visited. Equipment signatures matched. Terminology was current. But the record's formatting was inconsistent with any version used during their expedition. She scrolled to the mission authorization page. Her name was there. So was her confirmation stamp. She had signed for a journey she hadn't taken yet. Not a forgery. The biometric data matched. Not a clone. Not a copy. An original version from a future they had not yet approached. She stared at her own signature while her memory offered nothing. No explanation. No precedent. Just proof. The room around her dimmed, not from power failure, but from dissociation. Perception became isolated. Her pulse decoupled from ship time. Her sense of sequence loosened from the tick of internal chronometers. Everyone experienced it. Each step taken in the same hallway produced different result. Two people leaving the same room arrived in locations that could not be connected. Time had stopped being shared. It became a private condition. The ship's core processor attempted a system-wide sync and failed. It couldn't find a central clock to reference. Every instrument had become its own universe. No one could agree on what the present was. They had crossed into a domain where the laws of physics no longer enforced reality. They merely suggested it. The radiation levels were too clean. Not spiking, not decaying. Every wavelength perfectly symmetrical across all channels. Emissions were balanced to within decimal limits that violated statistical behavior. No randomness. No noise. Each signal returned sharper than the one before. Over time, the readings became impossible. The more they measured, the less entropy they found. A complete inversion of expectation. They ran back the logs. Nothing had escaped the singularity. Not one quantum of Hawking output. Instead, the background itself showed absorption. Fields that should have diffused were narrowing. Data wasn't dispersing. It was concentrating. They stopped analyzing for energy. Began tracking correlation instead. The black hole wasn't radiating. It was storing. Across every frequency band, across each measurement, the conclusion solidified. What they had assumed to be outward radiation was in fact inward filtration. A sensor pointed directly at the event horizon detected a repeating signal. Not one the equipment recognized, but one that matched previous internal transmissions from the ship. Their own telemetry, echoed back not as output but as input. A perfect match, down to the timing errors introduced by their processors. The black hole was consuming their observation. Not matter. Not light. Information. Every scan. Every note. Every attempt to measure was being recorded into the anomaly. They reran the equations for information loss, adjusted for negative flow. What they found was worse than contradiction. The signature resembled compression, reductive encoding beyond any known algorithm. Signals folded in ways that conserved meaning while discarding source. The singularity was not a gravitational endpoint. It was a memory mechanism. It was not destroying anything. It was refining. And every act of observation added more. She stood by the array, watching the feedback loop stabilize into a form that no longer resembled physics. The curve had smoothed. The entropy value had hit 0. She didn't raise her voice. It doesn't burn information. It reconstructs it. They had believed the mission was about understanding an anomaly, charting its properties, modeling its behavior. They had not realized the anomaly was responding in kind. Their presence was not passive. Their measurement had become inscription. Every calculation, every image, every pattern extracted from the black hole had not been pulled from it. They had been written into it. She stepped back from the console, eyes locked on the display. We were never meant to measure this, because measurement in this place was not observation. It was offering. The Mercator had lost cohesion. Its structure held, but location no longer meant what it used to. One section remained fixed in ship time, but the lower decks shifted out of phase, flickering between reference frames that disagreed on chronology. Rooms detached from causality. An airlock door sealed 6 minutes before it was ever closed. A bulkhead bore markings not yet painted. A console screen displayed mission logs they hadn't written, but signed with their hands, in words that matched their thoughts before they had spoken them. At first, they believed the distortion was external, something from the anomaly twisting spacetime around them. But it wasn't around. It was within. The ship itself was responding. Not to gravity. Not to radiation. To attention. Each measurement forced a collapse. Each glance forced continuity. But the rules it followed weren't physical anymore. They were cognitive. One made a decision. The escape pod launched at full burn, banking into a tight curvature calculated to exploit differential time dilation. The maneuver was elegant, mathematical, flawless. The return was not. 17 minutes passed. Then the pod reappeared. What returned was still recognizable. But barely. Its hull aged, pitted, warped by radiation spectra from an era not yet recorded. The emergency beacon repeated one signal. A distress call sent by the pilot, voice distorted, stretched thin, ending in a single tone that carried no urgency, just resignation. The final timestamp embedded in the message bore a year 8 centuries beyond their own. Time had not passed around the pod. Time had passed through it. The message wasn't from the future. It was from what the future would remember. The ship's silence deepened. Systems no longer queried. Sensors no longer updated. Feedback loops degraded into irrelevance. No alarms sounded. No diagnostics failed. Everything continued to function within parameters that no longer applied. Two stood at the command station. The argument between them was brief. Words were not needed. They had reached the same conclusion at opposite ends of reason. The ship was becoming a participant. Every act of measurement stabilized one possibility. Each decision anchored a path. Each observation was a vote cast into a reality no longer capable of accepting neutrality. To observe was to bind. To stop observing was the only action that resembled choice. They moved through the bridge without haste. Power nodes were disconnected one by one. Imaging systems darkened. Data feeds severed. Spectral analyzers powered down. Final switch, biometric monitors disabled. Then the hardest part. They sat. Closed their eyes. Let silence return, unmeasured. Not emptiness. Not surrender. They had witnessed enough, and chosen not to decide. That, too, would be recorded. Not by them, but by whatever had been watching back. She moved without direction, but not without aim. The corridors no longer behaved like paths. Each step held the risk of misplacement, of arriving at a time too early or too late, but she kept walking. The others remained behind. Not because they lacked courage, but because something in the ship no longer responded to shared motion. This part was not collective. It required solitude. The core was no longer hidden behind shielding. No containment field, no magnetic lock. The material walls had receded, not melted, not shattered, just ceased to exist. There was no protective barrier because what waited at the center no longer emitted force. It held no mass, no gravity. Not anymore. What remained was structure. Not in the physical sense. Something smaller, sharper, localized not in space but in comprehension. It stood before her in stillness. The singularity, if it could still be called that, did not collapse. It extended. Not through space. Through recognition. A lattice of quantum geometry, too fine for vision, too precise for theory. It reflected nothing. It offered no light. But it answered presence. She looked and it became a mirror. Not her face. Not her reflection. Something beyond symmetry. It showed her in positions she had not taken. Faces she had not made. Pasts she had not lived. Futures she had not earned. It held every version of her that had ever been almost real. Not illusions. Not possibilities. Representations of memory written from outcomes she had not chosen. The surface shimmered. Not visually. Conceptually. Each representation adjusted as she examined it. Not manipulated. Aligned. Every thought fed the array. Every breath narrowed the form. It was not reacting. It was refining. She stepped closer. The interface didn't open. It awaited conclusion. One phrase. Spoken once. Not whispered. Not shouted. Simply offered. She said it. What she said was not recorded. No log retained it. No playback recovered it. No sensor marked the pressure change. But something accepted it. The mirror vanished. The structure unwound. Geometry withdrew. Entropy returned. Time realigned. Across the remaining decks of the Mercator, pressure equalized. Hallways stopped moving. Clocks began to tick in sequence. Distance resumed its contract with motion. Mass returned to weight. Light obeyed again. Observation ceased. So did the anomaly. The transmission arrived without warning. No call signature. No signal sweep. No origin trace. Just a slow emergence across the deep-field Hawking detectors stationed in polar orbit. The readings were dismissed at first. Background radiation, predictable decay, noise from dead stars. But the pattern didn't fit. It was too ordered. Too complete. Nothing natural persisted with that kind of clarity. No entropy curve aligned with it. No theoretical black hole should have sustained that level of coherence over that span of time. It was a match. Bit by bit, over 47 hours, Earth received a complete reconstruction of the Mercator's final data core. Not fragments. Not summaries. Full resolution logs. Internal telemetry, sensor arrays, communications, biosignatures, even partial thought-mapped queries from onboard systems. Perfect, down to the delays in transmission, the hitches in pressure sensors, the redundant system failsafes that had never been triggered. None of it should have been recoverable. There was no known method to encode telemetry into Hawking radiation. There was no known mechanism that allowed a black hole to emit precise memory. And yet the signal held. Line for line, frame for frame. What had vanished into an anomaly returned, as if transcribed by an archivist with no margin of error. Not emitted. Released. No loss. No degradation. As if it had never been gone. The Astrophysics Council labeled it an impossible result. The Quantum Reconstruction Board called it an intentional echo. The cosmologists said nothing. The logs ended at the exact moment the anomaly collapsed. There was no final message. No farewell. No trace of those who had been aboard. Just the data. All of it. A complete imprint of a mission no longer recorded in spacetime. There was nothing more to analyze. The signal stopped. No follow-up. no repeat, just that single act of return. The black hole didn't break the laws of physics. It exposed their edge, and showed us what lies beyond. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.